Welcome back, guys, to another video, and today I'll be doing a video response to Michael Burhan, who made a video talking about top 5 games, retro games, that made him a gamer. Now, it took me a while to think of just 5 games because there's so many games that's kind of mold my palette of gaming, and it's always changing. I'm always, one time I was into, first-person shooters. I'm not into first-person shooters as much as I used to be, but thinking about retro, I try not to go too nostalgic. So I tried to kind of make a blueprint of the kind of gamer I am and what games made me that way. The first game I have to talk about, of course, is Street Fighter II, preferably Street Fighter II on the Super Nintendo. And the reason why is because this game introduced me to the fighting game genre. This made me love fighting games, and also growing up in the 90s, who did not dream about having an arcade, at the time what felt like an arcade perfect port at your house, playing an arcade game on the Super Nintendo, and Street Fighter II definitely had that flair. And after playing Street Fighter II, I went back and started playing Mortal Kombat, I started playing Tekken, Soul Edge, freaking Soul Calibur, and all the Neo Geo games and all that stuff. I became a huge fanatic when it came to fighting games, and it didn't start until I played Street Fighter II. The next game I want to talk about is the game that kind of started it all. Now, this wasn't my first video game, but this is the first video game I owned myself, and that is Super Mario Bros. 3. This was actually a bundle when I got my NES when I was a kid, and I remember I played this game so much that, when I was in first grade, we had like those journal entries, and we would write about what we did that weekend. I wrote about Nintendo and Super Mario so much that I actually had a parent-teacher conference where I was banned to mention Nintendo, because I would talk about Nintendo any chance I would get a chance to write something. I'd be talking about it. I remember it would be like, what's your favorite food? I'd be like, I love eating pizza. I like to eat pizza while I'm playing Super Mario. And it got to a point where I was like, I could not talk about it anymore. It was like unspoken words. But Super Mario 3 definitely was that game that really just made me enjoy video games, and I was like, wow, this is something that's freaking awesome. Now, number 3, and just to let you guys know, this isn't no particular order, these are just 5 games that popped in my head. Number 3, I actually had to talk about Shenmue II. Now, I know a lot of people are thinking, why not Shenmue 1? Honestly, I didn't play Shenmue 1 until a little bit later when I finally owned a Dreamcast, but I played Shenmue 2 when I got the OG Xbox, and it was my first time playing a game that had that sandbox kind of style to it. And I played Grand Theft Auto 3, but something about Shenmue was more atmospheric and more cinematic. I could go and do anything I wanted to, but it all tied into that story of Shenmue. And Shenmue 2, I loved it. And what I really liked about Shenmue 2 is it actually came with the DVD of Shenmue the movie, which was just pretty much all the cutscenes of the first Shenmue. So I almost tell people that when you want to play Shenmue, say you want to get into the series, get Shenmue 2 on the original Xbox, make sure it has that DVD, watch the DVD, and then play Shenmue 2, and you're down for a good time. Honestly, I cannot wait to Shenmue 3. Number 4 is going to have to be Dragon Warrior on the NES, and the reason why I picked this is this was my first JRPG I played. When I first got Dragon Warrior, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. I bought that and Double Dragon. It was pretty much my mom taught me into getting Dragon Warrior. She saw that had the dragon, and it was all knights and medieval, and she knew I was into that stuff. And I remember I took it home, and it was so much text to it, and at the time I did not like to read. I was like 7 years old, and I was having trouble with reading just because it didn't interest me. And I remember my mom was like, well, you can't play this game unless you learn how to read. So Dragon Warrior not only pushed my boundaries to new genres like the JRPG, but it also pushed my boundaries on learning how to read. A lot of people talk about, Tom Sawyer or, Goosebump books being like their first time getting into reading and enjoying it. Mine was JRPGs, and that, skyrocketed my whole obsession with games like Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest and Ys and Phantasy Star, Xenogears, Legend of Dragoon, so many great games that they feel like books, and I think that's the reason why I enjoy them so much. I feel like I can just be completely immersed in the JRPGs, but that all started, of course, with Dragon Warrior. Now, when I mentioned Super Mario Bros. 3, Atari not being my first video game, I do have to mention my first video game, and that is Missile Command on the Atari 2600. And this was the very first video game I ever played, and it actually belonged to my grandfather. He had an Atari 2600, and my grandfather was pretty much the one who got me into video games. He's the one that got me my first Nintendo, my first Super Nintendo. He's the one that got me the Sega Genesis, the Sony PlayStation. So many consoles that I have in my collection, so many games I have in my collection. I would not be having them if it wasn't for my grandpa, because he was also a big gamer as well, and he had one of those Atari 2600 Sears brand consoles. I remember every Thanksgiving I'd go over there and play Missile Command with him, or we'd play Pac-Man, which wasn't that great, but I still enjoyed it, and Donkey Kong and Pole Position. We would play those games on a really big Magnavox television. I think it was like a 20-inch, which was big back then, and that's where it all started. And I have to say, that's the one game that it really was like a downward spiral, positive downward spiral at that point of playing video games. So that's my top 5 retro games that made me a gamer. Now this is where I want you guys to come in. I want you guys to leave a comment below, tell me some of your top 5 games, or better yet, make a video response to Michael Burhan and leave it as a comment, as a link below, and maybe we can get a nice little chain thing going and make some video responses like the good old days of the community. So I would love to hear your thoughts and opinions, guys. As always, thanks for watching, thanks for subscribing, and as always, happy gaming.
Can't get enough of Access Gaming Podcast? Be sure to check out our audio podcast on Podomatic.com. You can also subscribe to us on iTunes. And if you have a YouTube channel or podcast you'd like to share, be sure to check us out on Facebook on our group page and join the community. As always, guys, thank you so much for all the support, and happy gaming.